My name is Cassidy, and I'm 32 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in my lawyer's office, staring at a stack of papers that make my stomach turn. My own parents are suing me for $50,000. The reason? I refuse to pay off my sister's massive credit card debt. My sister Brynn is 28 years old and hasn't worked in 4 years, but apparently that's my problem to solve. For years, my family has seen me as nothing more than a walking ATM machine, someone who exists only to fund their poor decisions and endless wants. But what they didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything. Every text message, every guilt trip, every manipulative phone call. And I was about to make them regret ever filing that lawsuit. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. If you've ever dealt with toxic family members who only see you as a source of money, hit that like button because you'll understand every word of what I'm about to share. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when I finally fight back, because trust me, the ending is going to shock you. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare really began. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I learned early that love in my family came with conditions. My parents, Marjorie and Dale, made it crystal clear from the time I could understand words that Brynn was special and I was useful. That's really the best way I can describe it now, after years of therapy helping me untangle the mess of my childhood. Brynn was the baby, born 4 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, she could do no wrong. She was pretty, with these big doe eyes and blonde curls that people always commented on. I was the serious one, the responsible one, the one who got straight A's because I knew grades were the only thing that got me positive attention. When I turned 15, I got my first job at a local diner, washing dishes and bussing tables after school. I wanted spending money like any teenager, but more than that, I wanted to prove I could take care of myself. I saved every penny I could, and by the time I was 17, I bought my own car with cash. It was a beat-up Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a radio that only worked half the time, but it was mine. I was so proud the day I drove it home. My parents barely looked up from watching television. 2 months later, Brynn turned 16, and my parents surprised her with a brand new SUV in the driveway, wrapped in a giant red bow like something from a commercial. She squealed and jumped up and down, and my parents beamed like they'd just won the lottery. I stood at my bedroom window watching the celebration below, feeling something hard and cold settle in my chest. That was the moment I realized I would never be enough, no matter what I did. College was the same pattern on a larger scale. I worked 3 part-time jobs while taking a full course load, barely sleeping, living off ramen noodles and dollar menu items. I cobbled together scholarships and grants, took out minimal student loans, and graduated with honors in marketing. My parents came to my graduation but left early because they had dinner plans. Brynn, meanwhile, got accepted to an expensive private liberal arts school 2 states away. My parents paid her entire tuition, room and board, meal plan, everything. She lasted 2 years before dropping out, claiming the pressure was too much and she needed to find herself. My parents hugged her and said they were proud of her for knowing her limits. When I asked them for $200 to help with textbooks my senior year, my mother said I was so capable that I would figure it out. I did figure it out. I always did. But the message was clear every single time. After graduation, I landed a marketing position at a decent firm in Chicago and moved into a tiny studio apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. Brynn moved back home and announced she was working on her art. She set up a studio in the guest bedroom and spent her days painting abstract pieces that, as far as I know, never sold a single canvas. My parents supported her completely, paying for supplies, giving her an allowance, letting her live rent-free. That's when the phone calls to me started. The first time, my mother called crying, saying Brynn's car had broken down and they didn't have the money to fix it right that moment. Could I help out with $500 just this once? I sent the money that day. 3 months later, It was $1,000 for dental work Brynn needed. Then $2,000 for a boutique business venture Brynn wanted to start. The boutique lasted 6 months before it closed, having sold almost nothing, because Brynn rarely showed up to actually run it. Each time I sent money, I told myself I was helping family. That's what you do, right? You help the people you love when they need it. But I started noticing something that made my blood boil. Brynn's Instagram was full of photos of expensive brunches with her friends, new designer handbags, weekend trips to music festivals. She wasn't broke. She was spending money that should have gone to her bills on things she wanted, knowing someone else would cover her actual responsibilities. That someone was usually me. When I started asking questions about why Brynn couldn't cut back on her spending or get a job to pay for these emergencies, my parents got defensive. They said I didn't understand how hard things were for her, how much she struggled with anxiety, how delicate she was. I had anxiety too. I just didn't have the luxury of letting it stop me from functioning. 4 years ago, Brynn quit her last job, a part-time retail position at a clothing store. She claimed her manager was toxic and the environment was damaging her mental health. I tried to be supportive at first, figuring she'd take a few weeks to decompress and then find something else. Those few weeks turned into months, then years. She hasn't held a job since. She still lives with my parents, rent-free, bill-free, responsibility-free. My parents enable every bit of it, making excuses, saying the job market is tough, saying she's looking but nothing is the right fit. Meanwhile, I started setting boundaries. I stopped automatically sending money every time they called. I started saying no and meaning it. That's when the guilt trips intensified. My father would call and give me speeches about family loyalty, about how they raised me and sacrificed for me, about how I made good money and should want to help. My mother would cry and say she didn't raise me to be selfish. They'd compare me to other daughters who took care of their families, who didn't abandon their sisters in times of need. Every conversation left me feeling hollowed out and horrible, questioning whether I was actually the terrible person they made me out to be. But a small voice in the back of my mind kept getting louder, asking why it was always me who had to sacrifice, why Brynn never had to change, why my needs never mattered. I was exhausted from years of being treated like a resource instead of a person. I didn't feel like a daughter. I felt like a paycheck with legs. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months before they filed the lawsuit. I was at work, in the middle of reviewing a campaign presentation, when my cell phone rang with my mother's number. I almost didn't answer because I was busy, but something made me pick up. The second I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. These hiccuping sobs that sounded genuinely panicked. My heart started racing because I immediately thought someone had died or was in the hospital. I stood up from my desk and walked quickly to an empty conference room, asking her what happened, begging her to calm down enough to tell me. When she finally got the words out, I felt the floor tilt under me. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was about money, but an amount so staggering I had to ask her to repeat it. Brynn had racked up $47,000 in credit card debt. 47,000. The number felt impossible. Creditors were calling the house constantly. Brynn's credit score was destroyed. Collection agencies were threatening legal action. My mother was in a complete panic, saying they needed my help, that this was an emergency, that I was the only one who could fix it. She wanted me to pay off the entire debt as a loan to Brynn, something Brynn would supposedly pay back over time. Even through my shock, I knew that payback would never happen. I asked the obvious question, the one that was screaming in my mind. How did Brynn even manage to get approved for that much credit? My mother explained, her voice getting defensive, that Brynn had opened multiple credit cards over the past few years. She maxed out each one, then opened another, then another. She bought designer clothes, went on trips with friends to places like Miami and Nashville, financed a BMW she couldn't afford, and that got repossessed after 4 months of missed payments. My head was spinning. I had been eating leftovers for dinner to save money for a house down payment while my unemployed sister was financing a luxury lifestyle on credit she had no ability to repay. The unfairness of it made me want to scream. I asked another obvious question. Why couldn't Brynn get a job and pay this debt herself like a responsible adult? My mother's answer made me see red. She said I knew how hard the job market was, that Brynn had been trying but nothing worked out, and that Brynn had such bad anxiety that the stress of this debt was making it impossible for her to function. She couldn't handle the pressure of a job on top of this situation. I actually laughed, a harsh sound that surprised even me. I told my mother that I had anxiety too. I had panic attacks in bathroom stalls at work. I had nights where I couldn't sleep because my mind wouldn't stop racing. But I still got up every morning and went to work because that's what adults do. That's what responsibility means. You don't get to just opt out of life because it's hard. My mother didn't like that answer. She started crying harder and said I was being cruel, that I didn't understand what Brynn was going through, that not everyone was as strong as me. Then my father got on the phone, and his approach was different but just as manipulative. He used the disappointed dad voice that had made me feel small my entire life. He said they raised me better than this, that family comes first, that you don't turn your back on people you love when they need you most. He brought up everything they ever did for me, as if those things were transactions instead of what parents are supposed to do. They paid for my braces when I was 13. They drove me to soccer practice. They gave me a roof over my head. He listed it all like I owed them a debt with interest. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I told him that they paid for Brynn's entire college tuition, while I worked myself to exhaustion to pay for mine. They bought her a car while I had to buy my own. They were still housing her at 28 years old, feeding her, supporting her completely. Everything they claimed to have done for me, they had done 10 times over for Brynn, without ever asking her for anything in return. How was that fair? How was any of this fair? My father said that was different, that Brynn needed more support, that I had always been independent. The implication was clear. Because I could handle things, I should handle everything. Because Brynn couldn't, she should be given everything. I asked them directly why they couldn't pay the debt themselves if it was such an emergency. There was a long pause, and then the truth came out. They had been supporting Brynn so completely for so many years that they had drained their retirement savings. They were in debt themselves. They had taken out a second mortgage on the house to cover expenses. They were drowning financially. And instead of making Brynn get a job or cutting her off, or doing any of the logical things parents should do with an adult child, they wanted me to bail everyone out. They wanted me to sacrifice my future so Brynn could continue living consequence-free. I told them I needed time to think. For 4 days, I barely slept. I ran the numbers over and over. I had $30,000 saved for a down payment on a house, something I'd been working toward for 5 years. I still had $12,000 left in student loans. If I paid Brynn's debt, I would have nothing. I would be starting over from zero. And for what? So she could learn that someone would always rescue her? So my parents could continue enabling her? So I could continue being the family's ATM while getting nothing but resentment and demands in return? On the 5th day, I called my parents back and told them no. I explained that I couldn't and wouldn't pay $47,000 for debt that Brynn chose to take on. I was saving for my own future. I had my own financial obligations. But I offered an alternative. I would sit down with Brynn and help her make a realistic budget. I would help her write a resume and practice interview skills. I would support her in getting a job and creating a payment plan for the debt. I would help her help herself. But I wouldn't do it for her. My mother's response was immediate and harsh. She said Brynn didn't need a lecture or a life coach. She needed money, and she needed it now. Either I was going to help my family or I wasn't. I said I wasn't, not like this. The phone call ended with my mother hanging up on me. For 3 days, no one contacted me. Then the text messages started. My father sent long paragraphs about how disappointed he was, how I had changed, how money had made me cold. My mother sent Bible verses about honoring your parents and helping the less fortunate. Brynn sent the most vicious messages of all, saying she couldn't believe I would let my own sister suffer, that I was dead to her, that I was a selfish monster who cared more about money than family. Each message felt like a knife, but I didn't respond. I just felt this strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because that's what they had trained me to feel my whole life. Relief because for the first time, I had stood up for myself. The silence from my immediate family lasted about 2 months, but I should have known they weren't just accepting my decision quietly. The first sign something was wrong came when my Aunt Lorraine called me out of the blue on a Saturday morning. We weren't particularly close, maybe saw each other twice a year at holidays, but her tone was immediately icy in a way I'd never heard from her before. She said she heard what I did to Brynn and that she was very disappointed in me. I was confused, asking what exactly she had heard, and she said she knew I refused to help when my sister was drowning in debt despite making plenty of money to afford it. Over the next few weeks, more family members reached out with similar messages. My cousin Mitchell unfriended me on Facebook without explanation. My uncle Philip sent a long email about family loyalty and how I had changed for the worse since moving to the city, implying that I had become materialistic and selfish. A second cousin I barely knew left a comment on one of my Instagram photos telling me I should be ashamed of myself. Each contact made it clearer that my parents and Brynn were telling everyone a very specific version of events, and it wasn't anywhere close to the truth. Through careful conversations with the few family members who actually asked for my side, I pieced together the narrative being spread about me. According to the story my parents and Brynn were telling, I made around $300,000 a year at my job. In reality, I made $75,000, which was decent but certainly not wealthy, especially in Chicago. They claimed I had millions of dollars saved up in various accounts. I had $30,000, my entire 5-year savings. They were telling people that Brynn was disabled and physically unable to work. She was perfectly healthy, just unwilling. They strongly implied that I had stolen money from the family over the years and that this refusal to help was me being vindictive. The worst part was they were painting themselves as desperate parents caught between 2 daughters, one who needed help and one who had the means but refused out of spite. The lies were so outrageous that part of me wanted to laugh, but the damage they were doing was real. My extended family had known me my entire life, and yet they were believing these stories without question. No one called to ask if any of it was true. They just accepted what they were told and turned on me. It showed me how little they really knew me, how little they actually cared to know the truth. I was being erased and rewritten into a villain in a story that had nothing to do with reality. Then Brynn took the campaign public on social media. She started posting vague Facebook statuses about betrayal and abandonment. One post said, "It's sad when people who claim to love you abandon you in your darkest hour." Another said, "Blood doesn't mean anything to some people once they get a little success." She posted photos of herself crying, writing captions about how she was learning who her real friends were and who only pretended to care. People who didn't know the situation flooded the comments with heart emojis and messages of support, telling her to stay strong, saying that people who abandon family don't deserve her. Some of her friends tagged me in comments, trying to shame me publicly. I didn't respond to any of it, but I started taking screenshots of everything. Something in my gut told me I would need evidence of this later, though I didn't know why yet. I created a folder on my computer labeled Evidence and started saving every text message, every email, every social media post. I documented dates and times of phone calls, summarized what was said, kept records of every dollar I had ever sent to my family over the years. It became almost obsessive, but it felt necessary. The harassment spread beyond social media. A family friend named Meredith cornered me in the cereal aisle of the grocery store one Sunday morning. I was just trying to buy breakfast, and suddenly she was blocking my cart, her face twisted in disgust. She told me I should be ashamed of myself, that my sister was suffering while I was living my best life without a care in the world. I tried to explain that the situation was more complicated than she knew, that I hadn't abandoned anyone, that I had tried to help in other ways. She cut me off, saying she didn't want to hear excuses. According to her, actions speak louder than words, and my actions showed I was selfish and cold. She walked away before I could say anything else, leaving me standing there shaking. My parents were active members of their church, a small community congregation where everyone knew everyone. I went to a funeral for a family acquaintance about 3 months after refusing to pay the debt, and the temperature in the room dropped when I walked in. People who had known me since I was a child looked at me with cold eyes or looked away completely. A woman who used to give me candy after Sunday school services walked right past me like I didn't exist. The pastor, who had baptized me, gave me a handshake that lasted half a second and excused himself quickly. I realized my parents had told their church community some version of the story, and I had been judged and found guilty without trial. What hurt most wasn't the strangers or distant relatives turning on me. It was realizing how easily my own parents could destroy my reputation to make themselves look better. They were willing to lie to everyone who would listen, to twist the narrative so completely that I became unrecognizable, all to avoid taking responsibility for enabling Brynn or admitting they had treated their daughters unequally for decades. They chose their pride over the truth. They chose protecting Brynn over protecting me. And I was supposed to just accept it because they were my parents. But I kept collecting evidence. Every nasty message got screenshotted. Every lie I heard about got documented with who said it and when. I wrote down every instance over the years where I had sent money, with dates and amounts. I pulled bank statements showing the transfers. I gathered proof of Brynn's social media posts showing her expensive lifestyle while claiming poverty. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for, but I knew I needed to be ready. My gut was telling me this wasn't over, and my gut was right. 4 months after I refused to pay Brynn's debt, I came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find an envelope taped to my apartment door. It was thick, official looking, the kind of envelope that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. I unlocked my door, dropped my work bag, and stood in my tiny kitchen opening the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a stack of legal documents, and the words at the top made the room spin. My parents, Marjorie and Dale, were suing me in civil court for $50,000. I had to read the complaint 3 times before my brain would process what I was seeing. They were claiming breach of verbal contract and something called promissory estoppel, which I had to look up. Essentially, they were arguing that I had promised over the years to help family in emergencies, that they had relied on these promises, and that they suffered financial damages when I broke my word. They listed every time I had sent money in the past as evidence of an ongoing agreement. They claimed that my pattern of helping had created a reasonable expectation that I would continue to help, and that this expectation was legally binding. The allegations were absurd. I had never signed anything. I had never made any formal promises about future help. Every time I sent money, it was a gift, a choice, not a legal obligation. But there it was in black and white, an official lawsuit filed in court, claiming I owed them $50,000 for refusing to pay my adult sister's credit card debt. I sat on my kitchen floor with the papers spread around me and tried not to cry. How had it come to this? How had my own parents decided that suing their daughter was an acceptable thing to do? I called my friend Jeremy, who's a lawyer though, not the kind who handles this type of case. He talked me down from the panic attack I was having and referred me to a litigation attorney named Miss Patterson. I called her office first thing the next morning and got an emergency appointment for that afternoon. Miss Patterson was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that made me feel slightly less terrified. She read through the lawsuit while I sat across from her desk, and I watched her eyebrows go higher and higher. When she finished, she looked at me and said this was one of the weaker cases she'd seen in terms of legal merit. Verbal contracts require specific terms and consideration, and from what she could see, my parents had neither. However, she cautioned, I still needed to respond. Ignoring a lawsuit, even a frivolous one, would result in an automatic judgment against me. She asked if I wanted to fight it, and I said yes without hesitation. She quoted me a $3,000 retainer to start. I paid it that day with money from my house down payment savings, feeling sick as I watched that number drop. That evening, I tried calling my parents. I needed to hear from them why they thought this was acceptable, why they would do this to their own child. My father answered on the third ring, his voice cold and flat. I asked him how they could sue me, how they could really think this was okay. His response was like a slap. He said I left them no choice. Brynn was drowning. They couldn't help her financially anymore. I could afford to help and was refusing out of what? Stubbornness? Pride? He said I had stopped being their daughter when I turned my back on my sister. I tried to argue, to explain my side one more time, but he hung up on me mid-sentence. The next few weeks were a nightmare of legal preparation, but things got worse. Brynn started showing up at my workplace. The first time, I was walking to my car after work and heard someone screaming my name across the parking lot. I turned to see Brynn running toward me, her face red and twisted with rage. She got right in my face, screaming that I was killing her, that her ruined credit and debt collectors were my fault, that I had the power to fix everything and was choosing to watch her suffer. Security guards had to escort her off the property. She sent me over 300 text messages that night, each one more unhinged than the last. The messages ranged from desperate pleas to violent wishes. She told me I was a monster, that she hoped I died alone, that no one would ever love someone as cold and heartless as me. She said she wished I had never been born, that the family would be better off if I disappeared. Miss Patterson advised me to save everything and consider getting a restraining order if Brynn showed up at my work again. I felt unsafe in my own life, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if she would be waiting somewhere. But in the middle of all this chaos, something unexpected happened. My co-worker Simone, who had witnessed one of Brynn's parking lot meltdowns, pulled me aside one day and asked what was going on. I broke down and told her everything. The whole sordid story. She listened without interrupting, her expression getting more horrified as I talked. When I finished, she looked me dead in the eye and said I needed to fight this with everything I had. More than that, she said I needed to go on the offensive. She asked if I had considered countersuing, and the idea hadn't even occurred to me. But once she said it, something clicked into place. I wasn't going to just defend myself. I was going to make them face consequences for what they'd done. Miss Patterson immediately requested financial discovery from my parents as part of building our defense. In a lawsuit, both sides have to provide relevant documents, and my parents would have to show their bank statements, tax returns, and proof of their claimed financial hardship. I also decided to do some investigating on my own. Something about the whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't articulate, so I requested a copy of my credit report from all 3 bureaus. What I found when those reports arrived made me physically sick. My name was on 3 credit cards I had never opened. I stared at the accounts listed, reading the details over and over. The cards had been opened 4 years ago, right around the time Brynn quit her last job. The total fraudulent debt in my name was $18,000. The cards were maxed out, in collections, destroying my credit score. I had never seen statements for these cards because they had been sent to my parents' address, the address I grew up in but hadn't lived at in over a decade. Someone had used my personal information to open credit in my name and had racked up massive debt that I knew nothing about. The spending patterns matched Brynn's lifestyle exactly. I cross-referenced the dates of charges with her Instagram posts, and it lined up perfectly. A charge for a designer handbag on the same day she posted a photo with that bag. Charges for a hotel in Miami during the week she posted beach photos from Miami. It was all there, a paper trail of identity theft. My own sister had stolen my identity, and my parents had either helped her do it or had known and said nothing. I filed a police report the next morning. The detective assigned to my case, Officer Brennan, was a tired-looking man in his 40s who seemed genuinely angry on my behalf as I explained the situation. He said identity theft is taken very seriously, especially when it involves family members, because it shows a level of premeditation and betrayal. He started an investigation, and within 2 weeks, he had found evidence pointing directly to Brynn. The IP addresses used to fill out the credit card applications traced back to my parents' home. The email addresses used for the accounts were variations of Brynn's name. Purchase locations and timing matched her documented whereabouts. Miss Patterson was delighted in a grim sort of way. This changed everything. Not only was my parents' lawsuit without merit, but I now had grounds for a serious countersuit. She drafted a demand letter outlining the fraud, the defamation campaign, the harassment, and gave my parents 10 days to drop their lawsuit, pay restitution for the identity theft, issue a written apology retracting all the lies they had spread, and cease all contact with me. Otherwise, we would file a countersuit, and I would pursue criminal charges against Brynn. My parents didn't respond within the 10 days. Instead, their lawyer, a cheap local attorney named Mr. Whitmore, sent a one-sentence email saying his clients denied all allegations and would not settle. That was all the confirmation I needed. Miss Patterson filed our countersuit the same day, claiming fraud, identity theft, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We also filed a motion to dismiss my parents' lawsuit against me. Everything was now public record, and in the small town where my parents lived, public records get noticed. Within 48 hours, the story had spread through their community. Someone posted about it in the town's Facebook group, and hundreds of comments appeared. People who had believed my parents' lies about me were suddenly asking questions. Neighbors were gossiping. Church members were whispering. My Aunt Lorraine called me screaming about how I had destroyed my parents' reputation, and I told her they destroyed it themselves by filing a frivolous lawsuit and covering up a crime. She hung up on me. Then I received an anonymous email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "You should know the truth," and inside were photos and receipts that made my blood boil. The email contained proof that my parents and Brynn had gone on vacation to Florida just 2 weeks before filing the lawsuit against me. They stayed at a nice beachfront resort, ate at expensive restaurants, and posted photos that they quickly deleted. The estimated cost of the trip was around $4,000. The person who sent the email signed it, a former friend, and said my parents weren't broke, they were greedy, and I deserved to know they had been lying about their financial situation. I forwarded everything to Miss Patterson immediately. This was proof that their entire claim of financial desperation was a lie. They had money for a luxury vacation but were suing me and claiming they were financially destroyed. It demolished any sympathy they might have gotten from a judge. Miss Patterson added this evidence to our case file, and I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in this entire nightmare, I felt powerful instead of victimized. Miss Patterson and I met in her office on a gray Saturday morning to plan our full strategy. She spread papers across the conference table and walked me through exactly what we were going to do. First, we would file a motion to dismiss my parents' lawsuit, which she was confident would succeed, given the lack of legal basis. Simultaneously, we would move forward aggressively with the countersuit. She outlined the claims: identity theft and fraud for the $18,000 in fake credit cards plus punitive damages, defamation for the lies spread throughout the family and community, and intentional infliction of emotional distress for the sustained campaign of harassment and manipulation. We spent hours going through all the evidence I had collected over the months. I had bank records showing over $23,000 I had sent to my family over 8 years, proving I had been generous and helpful, not the cold monster they were painting me as. I had text messages and emails showing their manipulation tactics and guilt trips. I had screenshots of Brynn's social media posts showing her luxury lifestyle while claiming poverty, and posts where she defamed me publicly. I had messages from extended family members that proved the smear campaign. I had the credit card statements showing the fraudulent charges, the police report, and the investigation findings linking the fraud to Brynn. Miss Patterson identified several witnesses we could call. My best friend Tabitha had witnessed years of me being upset about family dynamics and could testify to the emotional toll. Simone from work had seen Brynn's harassment firsthand. Jeremy could testify to my distress when the lawsuit first arrived. Detective Brynn could provide expert testimony about the identity theft investigation. We would also call my financial advisor to demonstrate my actual income and savings, directly disproving my parents' claims that I was wealthy and hoarding money. Before filing the countersuit, Miss Patterson sent one final demand letter to my parents. It was comprehensive, outlining every single claim we had against them with the evidence to back it up. She gave them 10 days to drop their lawsuit, pay $18,000 for the fraud damages, issue a written apology to be sent to every family member, and posted publicly retracting their lies, and agree to a no-contact arrangement. The letter made it clear that if they refused, they would face a full countersuit and I would push for criminal prosecution of Brynn. The 10 days passed with no response except a brief email from Mr. Whitmore stating his clients denied everything and would not settle. I had expected this, but it still stung. They were choosing to double down rather than admit they were wrong. Fine. Miss Patterson filed the countersuit that afternoon, along with the motion to dismiss their case against me. She also sent copies of the filing to the local newspaper, knowing it would become a public story. In their small town, a lawsuit like this was big news. The reaction was immediate. Within 2 days, the story was everywhere in their community. The church my parents attended started getting questions. Neighbors stopped them to ask about it. Someone made a post in the town Facebook group that got hundreds of comments. Most of them shocked that parents would sue their own daughter and incredulous at the fraud allegations. My parents were facing public scrutiny and judgment for the first time. And according to a cousin who still spoke to me, they were not handling it well. Aunt Lorraine called me again, this time practically shrieking. She demanded to know what I had done, saying I had destroyed my parents' reputation and standing in the community. I told her very calmly that I had done nothing except defend myself and tell the truth. They destroyed their own reputation by lying, covering up a crime, and filing a baseless lawsuit. Everything that was happening to them was a consequence of their own choices. She told me I was heartless and hung up. I didn't feel heartless. I felt free. Then came the anonymous tip that changed everything. Another email from an untraceable address. This one containing even more damning information. The sender had included detailed photos and receipts from my parents' Florida vacation, showing just how expensive it really was. Luxury resort, premium dining, excursions, shopping. They had spent lavishly while crying poverty and demanding I pay my sister's debts. The email ended with a note saying my parents had been bragging at a family gathering about how stupid Cassidy was for giving us money all those years and laughing about me being a sucker. Reading those words hurt more than anything else in this entire ordeal. It confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. They didn't feel bad about using me. They felt smug. They had been mocking me behind my back while guilting me to my face. Any remaining shred of guilt I felt about fighting them evaporated. I forwarded the email to Miss Patterson and told her I wanted to pursue this as aggressively as legally possible. She smiled, a sharp expression that made her look almost predatory, and said that was exactly what she wanted to hear. 2 months later, we had our day in court for the motion to dismiss my parents' lawsuit against me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with high ceilings that made every sound echo. Judge Elkins presided, a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair and an expression that gave away nothing. My parents sat on one side with Mr. Whitmore, and I sat on the other with Miss Patterson. Brynn wasn't required to attend this hearing, but she showed up anyway, sitting in the gallery behind our parents and glaring at me with pure hatred. Mr. Whitmore stood to present my parents' case first. He argued that I had established a pattern of financial support over many years, creating what he called an implied contract. He claimed that my family had come to reasonably rely on my assistance based on my history of providing it, and that my sudden refusal caused them measurable financial harm. He tried to frame it as a moral obligation that had become a legal one through repeated performance. He called Aunt Lorraine and Uncle Philip as character witnesses. Aunt Lorraine took the stand and testified that I had always been vocal about wanting to help my family, that I had said multiple times over the years how important it was to take care of the people you love. Miss Patterson stood for cross-examination, and I watched her dismantle the testimony piece by piece. She asked Lorraine if I had ever signed any document promising to pay debts my sister incurred. Lorraine admitted I hadn't. Did I ever specifically state I would pay $47,000 for credit card debt? No. Did I ever receive anything of value in exchange for the money I gave, making it a contract rather than a gift? No. By the time Miss Patterson finished, Lorraine looked flustered and foolish. Uncle Philip fared no better. He tried to paint me as someone who flaunted her success while ignoring family needs, but Miss Patterson asked him pointed questions about how much money my parents had spent supporting Brynn versus me over the years. He admitted he didn't know exact figures. She asked if he was aware I had worked multiple jobs through college while Brynn's tuition was paid in full. He admitted he wasn't aware of that. She asked if he knew about the Florida vacation. He went pale and said no. The testimony that was supposed to help my parents was actually helping me. Then it was my turn to testify. Miss Patterson called me to the stand, and I was terrified my voice would shake, but years of dealing with my family had taught me how to stay calm under pressure. She walked me through the history methodically. I described the differential treatment growing up, the pattern of being seen as the responsible one, while Brynn was coddled. I provided specific examples with dates and amounts of money I had sent over the years, totaling $23,000. I explained that I had never promised to pay Brynn's credit card debt, that I had offered alternative help in the form of budgeting assistance and job search support, and that this was refused. Mr. Whitmore tried to shake me during cross-examination. He asked if I made a comfortable living, and I confirmed I made $75,000 a year, not the $300,000 my parents had claimed. He asked about my savings, and I stated I had $30,000 saved over 5 years, not millions. Every answer I gave directly contradicted the narrative my parents had spread. He asked why I wouldn't help my sister if I had the means, and I looked him directly in the eye and said because helping would mean enabling her continued refusal to take responsibility for her own life and choices. Then Miss Patterson introduced the evidence about the Florida vacation. She presented photos, receipts, and credit card statements showing my parents had spent roughly $4,000 on a luxury trip just 2 weeks before claiming they were financially devastated and desperate. She asked me if I had been aware of this vacation, and I said no. I learned about it from an anonymous source after the lawsuit was filed. The judge's expression changed, a flicker of distaste crossing her face as she examined the evidence. You could feel the mood in the courtroom shift. The most damaging evidence came next. Miss Patterson presented proof of the fraudulent credit cards opened in my name, the police report I had filed, and the investigation findings linking the fraud to Brynn. She displayed the credit statements showing $18,000 in charges I never authorized. She showed the timeline proving the cards were opened while Brynn had access to my personal information at my parents' house. She asked me directly if I had ever authorized anyone to open credit in my name, and I said absolutely not. I didn't even know these accounts existed until I pulled my credit report during this lawsuit. That's when Brynn lost control. From the gallery, she suddenly stood up and screamed that I was lying, that I had always lied about her, that I was making everything up. Judge Elkins immediately banged her gavel and told Brynn she needed to be silent or leave. Brynn ignored her, continuing to yell about how I had everything while she had nothing, how this was all my fault, how I was destroying the family. The bailiff had to physically escort her from the courtroom while she screamed and struggled. My parents looked mortified, but the damage was done. The judge had just witnessed exactly the kind of unstable, entitled behavior I had been describing. Judge Elkins asked my parents directly if they had known about the identity theft. There was a long, horrible silence. Finally, my father admitted they had suspected something, but didn't know what to do. The judge's voice went cold. She asked how they could suspect their daughter was committing identity theft against their other daughter, and not only do nothing but then sue the victim for refusing to pay the fraudulent debt. My mother started crying, saying they were caught in an impossible situation, that they were trying to help both daughters. Judge Elkins was unmoved. Judge Elkins took less than 10 minutes to make her decision on the motion to dismiss. She stated for the record that she had reviewed all evidence and heard all testimony, and that this was one of the most frivolous lawsuits she had encountered in her 23 years on the bench. Her voice was sharp with disapproval as she explained that there was no legal basis whatsoever for my parents' claims. No contract, verbal or written, existed. No specific terms had been agreed upon. No consideration had been exchanged. The pattern of voluntary gifts did not create a legal obligation for future gifts. She went further, noting that the evidence showed a disturbing pattern of financial exploitation and manipulation of me by my own family members. She said the lawsuit appeared to be an attempt to weaponize the legal system to force me to continue being financially exploited, which was an abuse of the courts, resources, and time. She dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled, and ordered my parents to pay my legal fees incurred in defending against their baseless claims. The relief I felt was so overwhelming I thought I might pass out. But we weren't done. That same afternoon, we had the hearing for my countersuit. Now the roles were reversed. I was the plaintiff. My parents and Brynn were the defendants, and Miss Patterson was presenting our case for fraud, defamation, and emotional distress. She laid out the evidence methodically, building an airtight case that even I found compelling, and I had lived through it. The identity theft documentation was presented first. Miss Patterson showed the fraudulent credit card accounts, the investigation report from Detective Brynn, the timeline connecting the spending to Brynn's documented lifestyle, and the IP addresses proving the applications came from my parents' home. She called Detective Brynn as an expert witness, and he testified that in his professional opinion, Brynn had committed identity theft, and my parents had at minimum been complicit through their knowledge and inaction. Next came the defamation evidence. Miss Patterson presented screenshots of social media posts, text messages from family members confronting me based on lies, and testimony from witnesses about the specific false statements that had been spread. She showed the posts where Brynn publicly implied I was abandoning a disabled sister when Brynn was perfectly healthy. She presented evidence of the false income and savings figures my parents had told people. She demonstrated that these lies had been told deliberately, repeatedly, and to numerous people with the intent of damaging my reputation. The emotional distress claim was supported by records from my therapist, who testified with my permission that I had been diagnosed with anxiety and depression, directly linked to family trauma and the ongoing harassment. She described how the lawsuit and smear campaign had affected my mental health, my sleep, my ability to focus at work. Tabitha testified about witnessing years of me being used and manipulated by my family. Simone described the workplace harassment from Brynn. The picture that emerged was of sustained, intentional psychological abuse. Mr. Whitmore barely mounted a defense. He tried to argue that the credit card use was born of desperation rather than malicious intent, but Judge Elkins shut that down immediately, stating that identity theft is identity theft regardless of the perpetrator's claimed motivations. He attempted to frame the defamation as just family members venting frustrations, but Miss Patterson had evidence that the lies were calculated, specific, and spread widely with clear intent to harm my reputation and relationships. My parents attempted to testify in their own defense, and it went poorly. My mother cried through most of her testimony, playing the victim and talking about how hard it was to have two daughters with such different needs, how they were just trying to help everyone. Judge Elkins asked her directly how spreading lies about me constituted helping me, and my mother had no answer. My father tried to be stoic, claiming they had done what any parents would do, but he couldn't explain why suing me and covering up fraud qualified as normal parental behavior. Brynn didn't show up for the afternoon session. Her absence was noted by the court, and Miss Patterson pointed out that the defendant's refusal to appear to defend her actions spoke volumes. A default judgment would likely be entered against her for her portion of the liability. I found out later that Brynn had left the courthouse after being removed from the morning session and hadn't come back, apparently telling my parents she couldn't handle being there. Judge Elkins took even less time with this verdict. She ruled in my favor on all counts, finding my parents and Brynn jointly and severally liable for damages. She awarded $18,000 for the fraudulent debt that had destroyed my credit. She awarded $15,000 in compensatory damages for defamation, noting that the lies had damaged my relationships with extended family and caused social harm in both their community and mine. She awarded $20,000 for intentional infliction of emotional distress, citing the sustained nature of the harassment and the severity of the psychological impact. On top of that, she ordered them to pay $12,000 to cover my legal fees and court costs from both defending against their lawsuit and pursuing my countersuit. She added $5,000 in punitive damages, stating that the behavior had been egregious enough to warrant punishment beyond compensation. The total came to $70,000. Additionally, she issued a permanent restraining order requiring my parents and Brynn to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times and prohibiting any form of contact. My mother collapsed into sobs. My father sat completely still, his face gray. Aunt Lorraine and Uncle Philip, who had stayed for the afternoon session, slipped out of the courtroom quickly, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Miss Patterson squeezed my shoulder and said quietly that I had won. Truly won. But sitting there watching my parents absorb the verdict, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. This was my family, and it had come to this. As I left the courthouse, my parents tried to approach me despite the bailiff's warning that the restraining order was effective immediately. The bailiff stepped between us, and my father shouted over his shoulder that I couldn't do this, that they were my parents. I stopped walking, turned to face him fully, and said loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear that they stopped being my parents when they decided I was a resource instead of a person. Then I walked out into the afternoon sun and didn't look back. The week following the verdict was surreal. I kept waiting to feel something, happiness or satisfaction or even anger. But mostly I felt numb. My parents and Brynn were legally required to pay me $70,000, but Miss Patterson warned me that collecting would be difficult. They could drag out the process, claim inability to pay, force us to pursue wage garnishment or liens on property. She began the collection process immediately, filing the necessary paperwork to garnish my father's wages and place a lien on their house if necessary. I knew I might never see the full amount, but honestly, that had never been the point. The point was standing up for myself. The point was making sure there were consequences for what they did. The extended family split predictably. Aunt Lorraine and Uncle Philip sent a joint email calling me cruel and vindictive, saying I had destroyed the family and they wanted nothing to do with me. A few others quietly took their side, unfriending me on social media, or simply stopping all communication. But others reached out privately with apologies. My cousin Heather sent a long message saying she was sorry for believing the lies without asking for my side, that what my parents did was wrong, and that she hoped we could rebuild our relationship. Cousin Mitchell, who had unfriended me months ago, sent a friend request with a simple message: "I'm sorry. I should have asked you directly. I accepted some of these olive branches and declined others." The people who had attacked me most viciously, I had no interest in letting back into my life. But those who had simply been misinformed and were willing to acknowledge that, I gave them a chance. The family would never be what it once was. But then again, what it once was had been dysfunctional and toxic. Maybe having a smaller, more authentic circle was better than a large group built on lies and manipulation. Brynn's consequences extended beyond the civil judgment. The district attorney's office reviewed the identity theft case and decided to pursue criminal charges. She was arrested, charged with 3 counts of identity theft, and faced the possibility of jail time. She took a plea deal that included 2 years of probation, mandatory restitution for the fraudulent charges, and community service. She also finally got a job, a position at a fast food restaurant, because she had to prove employment to satisfy the terms of her probation. I heard through the family grapevine that she blamed me for ruining her life. Even facing criminal consequences for her own actions, she couldn't accept responsibility. My parents faced their own reckoning. The financial judgment against them was devastating to their already strained finances. They couldn't afford to pay it outright, so their house went into foreclosure once the lien was placed. They had to sell and move into a small apartment across town. Their retirement savings, already depleted from years of enabling Brynn, were completely gone. My father's health declined, stress-related issues that landed him in the hospital twice in 3 months. Their standing in the church community never recovered. People knew what they had done, and small-town judgment is harsh and lasting. About a month after the verdict, a letter arrived at Miss Patterson's office addressed to me. My mother had written it, clearly violating the restraining order's no-contact provision. Miss Patterson opened it first to review, then asked if I wanted to read it. I said yes. The letter was 3 pages of my mother's handwriting, shaky and hard to read in places. It said, "I hope you're happy now. You've destroyed our family. We gave you life, we raised you, and this is how you repay us. Your father is sick because of the stress you've caused. We've lost our home. Your sister has a criminal record. All because you were too selfish to help when we needed you. I will never forgive you for what you've done to this family." I read it twice, then handed it back to Miss Patterson and told her to file it as evidence of the restraining order violation. I felt nothing reading those words. No guilt, no anger, no sadness. Just a distant observation that even now, even after everything, my mother couldn't see how they had brought this on themselves. She still saw me as the villain. And that was okay. I didn't need her to understand. I didn't need her forgiveness. I needed to heal, and that meant letting go of the need for her to ever acknowledge the truth. Therapy became my lifeline during those months. I had been seeing a therapist since the lawsuit started, but after the verdict, we dove deeper into the decades of family dysfunction that had led to this point. She helped me understand concepts like scapegoating and parentification, explaining how I had been assigned the role of family caretaker from a young age, while Brynn was designated the one who needed care. She helped me see the patterns of narcissistic family dynamics, where one child is the golden child who can do no wrong, and the other is the scapegoat who gets blamed for everything. Understanding these patterns didn't make the hurt go away, but it helped me realize I had never been the problem. The system was broken, and I had simply been born into the wrong role. I joined a support group for adult children of dysfunctional families and found incredible healing in sharing my story with people who understood. Hearing other people's experiences of being used, scapegoated, and manipulated by family members made me feel less alone. These people got it in a way that friends with healthy families never could. We supported each other through the grief of losing families that were never really what we thought they were. We celebrated small victories in setting boundaries and building lives separate from the toxicity. My real life, my chosen life, started to flourish. My best friend Tabitha stood by me through everything, never wavering. My coworker Simone became a close friend, someone who witnessed my lowest moments and never judged. Jeremy, the lawyer who had connected me with Miss Patterson, checked in regularly to make sure I was okay. These people, along with a few others, became my true family. We celebrated holidays together. We supported each other through hard times. We showed up for each other in ways my blood family never had. I even started dating again. I had put my romantic life completely on hold during the lawsuit, too stressed and emotionally drained to even think about relationships. But 6 months after the verdict, a friend set me up on a blind date with a guy named Graham, an architect with kind eyes and an easy laugh. I was honest with him from the start about what I had been through, figuring if it scared him off, better to know early. Instead, he listened to the whole story and said he admired my strength. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully. He never pushed, never demanded, never tried to manipulate. It was such a stark contrast to every interaction with my family that sometimes it made me emotional just experiencing what healthy love looked like. A year after the verdict, I finally had enough saved again to put a down payment on a house. It was small, a 2-bedroom cottage with a little yard in a quiet neighborhood. It needed some work, but it was mine, bought with money I earned and saved. A home no one could take from me or make me feel guilty about. I spent weekends painting walls in colors I loved, planting a garden, making the space entirely my own. I adopted a rescue dog, a sweet mutt named Pepper, who had also survived trauma and just needed someone to love her. Every morning, I woke up in that house and felt peace. Then came the letter that provided unexpected validation. My younger cousin Vivian, who was only 20, sent a carefully worded letter to Miss Patterson's office to avoid violating my restraining order directly. She wrote that she had been at a family gathering at my parents' apartment about 6 months after the verdict. My parents and Brynn were there, along with a few others who still associated with them. Vivian overheard them talking and laughing about me, saying things like Cassidy was so stupid, giving us money for all those years, and she actually believed we were proud of her. Can you imagine? They were mocking me, calling me a sucker, laughing about how easy I had been to manipulate. Vivian was horrified. She wrote that she had looked up to my parents her whole life, but hearing them talk like that made her see them clearly for the first time. She apologized for not speaking up sooner, for believing their version of events. She said I deserved so much better than I got from them. Reading her letter hurt, but it also healed something. It confirmed what I had suspected, that their love had always been conditional, transactional, and ultimately fake. But it also showed me that truth has a way of revealing itself. I wrote back to Vivian, thanking her for her honesty and encouraging her to learn from what she witnessed. I told her to set boundaries early, to protect herself, to never let anyone make her feel guilty for saying no. As time passed, I reflected deeply on everything I learned from this experience. I learned that you cannot save people who don't want to be saved, that all the love and money in the world won't fix someone who refuses to change. I learned that boundaries are not selfish acts but necessary protections, that saying no doesn't make you a bad person. I learned that family is not defined by blood but by love, respect, and reciprocity. The people who show up for you, who treat you with dignity, who celebrate your successes instead of resenting them, those are your real family. I learned that enabling is not helping, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. I learned that you can't set yourself on fire to keep others warm, a phrase my therapist repeated until it sank in. Self-preservation is not betrayal. Taking care of yourself is not abandonment. You are allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they're related to you. Especially if they're related to you. Sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing the game entirely. One afternoon, 2 years after the lawsuit, I was sitting on my back porch with Graham and Pepper, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. I realized I hadn't thought about my parents or Brynn in weeks. They used to occupy so much space in my mind, a constant source of anxiety and hurt, but slowly, gradually, they had faded to the edges of my awareness. I felt no anger when I thought of them now, no bitterness, no longing for reconciliation, just a quiet sense of peace and the knowledge that I was exactly where I needed to be. People ask me sometimes if I regret how everything went down. if I wish I had just paid the money to keep the peace? The answer is always no. I didn't lose my family in that courtroom. I escaped from people who never saw me as family to begin with. They taught me that I was only worth what I could give them, that my value was measured in dollars and compliance. So I taught them something in return. I taught them that I'm worth far more than that I won't be used or manipulated or diminished anymore. And now I live every day proving that to myself. If you're reading this and you see yourself in my story, I need you to know something. You are not the villain for having boundaries. You are not selfish for refusing to be used. You are not cruel for protecting yourself from people who hurt you. You are enough, exactly as you are, without giving pieces of yourself away until there's nothing left. Walk away from people who only love what you can do for them, not who you are, and build a life so full of genuine love and respect that their absence becomes a blessing instead of a burden. That's the best revenge of all. Happiness they can't touch, peace they can't disturb, a life they can't ruin. I still have hard days. Sometimes I see a family having dinner together at a restaurant and feel a pang of grief for what I never had. Sometimes I wonder what holidays would be like if my family had been different, if they had loved me the way I deserved. But then I come home to Graham and Pepper, to my cozy house and my garden and my chosen family, and I remember that I didn't lose anything real. I traded the illusion of family for the reality of genuine love, and that trade was worth every painful step it took to get here. So here's what I want you to take from my story. If you're trapped in a similar situation, if you're being used and manipulated and told it's love, know that you can get out. It won't be easy. They will fight you. They will try to guilt you and shame you and turn others against you. They will make you doubt yourself. But on the other side of that fight is freedom. On the other side is a life where you're valued for who you are, not what you can provide. On the other side is peace. And you deserve that peace more than they deserve your sacrifice. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who only saw you as an ATM? Have you dealt with the golden child versus scapegoat dynamic? Drop your experiences in the comments below because I know so many of you have similar stories, and sharing them helps us all feel less alone. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about overcoming toxic family dynamics and building the life you deserve. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away from people who hurt them, even family. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here and for supporting not just me but everyone who finds strength in knowing they're not alone in these struggles. I wish you all the courage to set the boundaries you need, the wisdom to recognize when love is real and when it's manipulation, and the peace that comes from choosing yourself. You deserve a life filled with people who genuinely care about you. And sometimes creating that life means letting go of people who never did. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and remember that you are worth so much more than you've been told.